Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Today we will be interviewing Langston Hughes. A bit about Langston Hughes before we begin the interview. Langston Hughes, better known as James Mercer Langston Hughes, was born February 1st, 1902 in Joplin, Missouri. He was better known for his jazz influence through his poetry. Now I would like to introduce the infamous and the famous Langston Hughes today. Thank you for joining us, Langston Hughes. All right, my first question for you is, what are some of the places you've traveled during your lifetime?
Well, in 1902, I was born in Joplin, Missouri, but moved to Lawrence, Kansas to live with my grandmother. In 1915, I moved to Lincoln, Illinois, and lived with my mother after the death of my grandmother. In 1916, my mother remarried, and we moved to Cleveland, Ohio. In 1920, after I graduated from high school, I moved to Mexico and taught English for about a year while living with my father. In 1921, I moved to Columbia University with the funds from my father. In 1923, I was employed as a steward, traveling to Africa and to Europe. In 24, I returned to the States and lived with my mother in D.C. In 1930, I traveled to Haiti. In 1932, I traveled to the Soviet Union and lived there for a year. 37, moved to Madrid. After the 40s, I lived in the States and, just bounced from state to state. In the summer of 1919 and 1920, I traveled to Mexico by train and had a lot of time to think and ponder on ideas in regards to social inequality during that time. You know what I'm talking about, Josh.
Were you writing anything at the time?
Yes, I was writing The Negro Speaks Rivers, which targeted a more profound view on which, as you know, African Americans are as people rather than what they are portrayed throughout American beliefs.
Interesting. What about Mexico? Made you love being there?
Mexico welcomed me with open arms, allowing homosexuals to assemble and transform Mexican drama, poetry, and literature. Next question.
Tell me a little bit about your experience as a steward.
Everywhere the sailors went, sexuality and homosexuality appeared. In Africa, the openness found in the ports absolutely stunned me. I visited male and female prostitutes there, Josh. And I saw two poor women getting gangbanged. Can you believe that? I didn't join, of course. And in 24, I took that second freighter to Africa, but jumped ship and made my way to Paris and eventually Italy.
What in Paris did you do?
Well, that is a little personal, Josh, but I'll share what I did if you must know. Well, I worked in the lesbian, gay, and back alley clubs of Paris.
You attended Columbia University in 1921. What was that like for you?
Yes, at Columbia University I faced discrimination in the dorms and felt uncomfortable being there, to be honest with you. That's when I discovered Harlem for the first time. The beautiful sounds of jazz gave me a new insight on life, Josh. Do you know what I'm saying?
Did Harlem jazz affect your writing? If so, how?
Harlem jazz confirmed my work view from the scaling of musical renditions, which painted a picture of truth that would always tell a different story.
Did Harlem jazz affect your writing style?
Yes, because Harlem bars and rent parties offered gay and lesbian performers, which made me feel more comfortable. In 1926, after seeing the performers, I later incorporated the rhythm into my first book, which, as you know, is The Weary Blues. The sounds of jazz bands and banters inspired me to be free in rhythm and writing. Do you know what I'm saying?
What happened after Columbia University?
After a year at Columbia University, I left as a crew member on a freighter bound for Africa. As I mentioned earlier, I was an employee as a steward traveling to Africa and to Europe.
Why did you get a job as a steward traveling to Africa and to Europe?
Well, let's just say I don't like to stay in one place for too long. You really need to change up the scenery, if you know what I'm saying.
In your travels to Mexico, you wrote The Negro Speaks to Rivers. And in that poem, you had a previous interview saying how that poem came about. And we have that clip, and I would love to show it, if you don't mind.
The Negro Speaks of Rivers, one of my earliest poems written in 1920, just after I came out of high school. The way this poem came to be written was that I was going to Mexico to visit my father, who lived in Mexico City, and on the train going across the Mississippi River, just outside St. Louis, I looked out the window and I saw this great muddy river flowing down toward the heart of the South, and I began to think about what this river meant to the Negro people, how, in a sense, our history was linked to this river, how in slavery time my grandmother told me that to be sold down the Mississippi was one of the worst things that could happen to a Negro slave. And then I remembered that I'd read about Abraham Lincoln going down the Mississippi as a young man, and he went on a raft to New Orleans, and he saw human beings bought and sold in the slave market there, and he was so horrified by this that he never forgot it. And many years later, of course, we know that it was Lincoln who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And so, as the train went on into the gathering dusk, because it had been about sunset when we crossed the river, I took my father's letter out of my pocket and began to write down on the back of his letter this poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers.